Captain Sarah Martinez stepped out of her dusty Humvee and onto the scorching asphalt of Fort Braxton's main training facility. The North Carolina sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling military base, creating waves of heat that distorted the air above the concrete. She had driven 3 hours from her post at Fort Davidson to attend what she hoped would be a routine meeting about expanding training opportunities for her unit. Sarah was not your typical Army captain. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the military's most skilled marksmen and tactical training specialists. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often fooled people into underestimating her abilities, something she had grown accustomed to throughout her 12-year military career. What they didn't see was the steel determination behind her calm brown eyes and the countless hours she had spent perfecting her craft. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the base's administrative building, an imposing structure that housed the offices of Fort Braxton senior leadership. As Sarah walked through the corridors lined with portraits of distinguished military officers, she reviewed her request in her mind. Her unit needed access to Fort Braxton's advanced shooting range facility to conduct specialized training exercises that weren't available at their smaller base. The range at Fort Braxton was legendary among military circles. It featured state-of-the-art equipment, variable distance targets, and simulation systems that could replicate combat conditions with remarkable accuracy. For Sarah's team of specialized marksmen, access to such a facility would mean the difference between good training and exceptional preparation for their upcoming deployment. Colonel Richard Blackwood's office was located on the 3rd floor, behind an impressive oak door adorned with military insignia and commendations. Sarah knocked twice and waited for permission to enter. The colonel's secretary, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, looked up from her computer screen. "Captain Martinez, to see Colonel Blackwood," Sarah announced, presenting her identification. The secretary glanced at her watch and frowned. "You're 5 minutes early." The colonel doesn't appreciate early arrivals any more than he appreciates tardiness. "Wait here." Sarah took a seat in the small waiting area, using the time to review her presentation materials one final time. She had prepared detailed documentation outlining her unit's training requirements, their qualifications, and the specific benefits that access to Fort Braxton's range would provide. Every detail had been meticulously researched and presented in a professional format that should have impressed any reasonable commanding officer. 20 minutes past the scheduled appointment time, the secretary finally looked up. "The colonel will see you now." Sarah gathered her materials and stepped into the spacious office. Colonel Blackwood sat behind an enormous mahogany desk that seemed to dominate the entire room. At 55, he was an imposing figure with graying hair, sharp blue eyes, and a chest full of ribbons and medals that spoke to a distinguished career. The walls of his office were covered with photographs showing him with various military and political dignitaries, creating an atmosphere designed to intimidate visitors. "Captain Martinez," Colonel Blackwood said, without looking up from the papers on his desk. "I understand you have some sort of request regarding my range facility." Sarah stood at attention, waiting for permission to sit. When none came, she remained standing and began her presentation. "Yes, sir. I'm requesting access to Fort Braxton's advanced shooting range for my specialized marksman unit. We have an upcoming deployment, and the training opportunities here would significantly enhance our readiness and effectiveness." The colonel finally looked up, his expression already showing signs of annoyance. "Your unit. How many people are we talking about?" 12 specialists, sir. All are expert-level marksmen with extensive combat experience. We would require approximately 40 hours of range time, spread over 2 weeks. Colonel Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair, a condescending smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 40 hours? Do you have any idea how much demand there is for my range time, Captain? I have 3 full battalions that train here regularly, plus visiting units from other bases, special operations teams, and VIP training sessions. Sarah maintained her composure despite the colonel's dismissive tone. "I understand the facility is in high demand, sir. That's why I've prepared a detailed schedule showing how our training could be integrated with existing programs. We're flexible on timing and would work around any existing commitments." The colonel barely glanced at the documents Sarah held out. Instead, he stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the training grounds. Tell me, Captain, what makes your little unit so special that they deserve priority access to the finest shooting range on the East Coast? The phrase little unit stung, but Sarah kept her voice steady. Sir, our team has achieved the highest marksmanship scores in our division for 3 consecutive years. We've been selected for specialized reconnaissance missions that require extreme precision shooting capabilities. The advanced simulation systems here would allow us to train for scenarios we can't replicate at our home base. Colonel Blackwood turned around, his smile widening into something that bordered on a smirk. Reconnaissance missions. How exciting. I'm sure your team does very important work. The way he emphasized certain words made it clear he was being sarcastic. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she pressed on. Sir, if I could show you our qualification scores and mission records, I think you'd find that our request is more than justified. I'm sure I would, the colonel replied, returning to his desk. But here's the thing, Captain. My range is designed for serious military training. We host some of the most elite units in the armed forces here. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon. These are warriors who need every advantage they can get. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a flash of anger. With respect, sir, my team consists of highly trained professionals who have served in multiple combat deployments. Our qualifications speak for themselves. Colonel Blackwood sat down heavily and picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers as he studied Sarah with obvious skepticism. I'm sure they do, but you have to understand my position here, Captain. I have limited resources and unlimited demand. I have to prioritize based on real operational needs, not training exercises. The way he said training exercises made it sound like Sarah was asking for permission to hold a recreational shooting event. She took a deep breath and tried a different approach. Sir, perhaps if you could review our specific training objectives and deployment requirements, you might reconsider. We're not asking for special treatment, just an opportunity to prepare our soldiers for the missions they've been assigned. The colonel set down his pen and looked directly at Sarah for the first time since she had entered the office. Captain, let me be perfectly clear. This is my base, and this is my range. I decide who gets access based on my assessment of military necessity and operational priority. Your unit, whatever its merits, simply doesn't meet those criteria. Sarah felt her heart sink, but she made one last attempt. Sir, is there anything we could do to demonstrate our qualifications? Any additional documentation or references that might change your mind? Colonel Blackwood's expression hardened. Captain, I think we're done here. My decision is final. Your request for range access is denied. The finality in his voice was unmistakable, but Sarah couldn't let it end like this. Sir, may I ask what criteria my unit would need to meet to qualify for access in the future? The colonel stood up, clearly indicating that the meeting was over. Captain, some units are simply better suited for different types of training. Perhaps you should focus on activities more appropriate for your team's capabilities. The condescension in his voice was so thick it was almost tangible. Sarah realized that no amount of documentation or professional presentation was going to change this man's mind. He had made his decision based not on her unit's qualifications or training needs, but on his own preconceptions about what a real military unit should look like. I understand, sir, Sarah said, gathering her and used materials. Thank you for your time. As she turned to leave, Colonel Blackwood called after her. Captain, one more thing. In the future, you might want to reconsider whether requests like this are worth the time and effort. Not every unit is cut out for advanced training. Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, she considered turning around and giving the colonel a piece of her mind. Instead, she simply said, "Noted, sir," and walked out. The walk back to her vehicle felt like the longest in her military career. The colonel's dismissive attitude and barely concealed contempt replayed in her mind with each step. She had faced discrimination and skepticism before, but rarely had it been so blatant and professionally damaging. As she drove away from Fort Braxton, Sarah's initial disappointment began to transform into something else entirely. The colonel's smugness and arrogant dismissal of her unit's capabilities had awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. He had basically challenge her team's competence and professionalism, and that was something she couldn't let stand. By the time she reached the highway, Sarah had made a decision. If Colonel Blackwood thought her unit wasn't worthy of his precious range, she would find a way to prove him wrong. She would show him exactly what her little unit was capable of, and she would do it in a way that would make his smugness evaporate like morning mist. The 3-hour drive back to Fort Davidson gave Sarah plenty of time to think. She knew that simply complaining about the colonel's attitude wouldn't accomplish anything. The military hierarchy was designed to support commanding officers, and challenging a colonel's decision without substantial justification would likely end her career. But there were other ways to make a point. Sarah began to formulate a plan that would not only vindicate her team, but also expose the colonel's poor judgment in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. It would require careful planning, impeccable execution, and a bit of luck, but Sarah was confident it could be done. When she finally arrived at Fort Davidson, Sarah went directly to her office and began making phone calls. The first call was to her team sergeant, Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, a 20-year veteran whose shooting skills were legendary throughout their division. Sergeant Chun, I need you to gather the team for an emergency meeting at 0800 tomorrow. Full dress uniforms, all qualification records, and mission files for the past 3 years. Everything go okay at Fort Braxton, ma'am? Chun asked, picking up on the tension in Sarah's voice. Let's just say we have some work to do, Sarah replied. I'll brief everyone tomorrow. Her next call was to her commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, a fair-minded officer who had always supported Sarah's initiatives. She requested a private meeting for the following afternoon, knowing she would need his approval for what she was planning. The final call of the evening was to an old friend from her days at the Army Marksmanship School. Major Lisa Rodriguez now worked in the Pentagon's Training Coordination Office and had access to information that could be crucial to Sarah's plan. Lisa, I need a favor. Can you pull the training schedules and performance records for Fort Braxton's shooting range over the past year? I need to know which units have been using it and how they've performed. That's an unusual request, Sarah. Mind if I ask what this is about? Let's just say I'm conducting some research on training effectiveness. I'll explain more when I see you next week. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in months. Colonel Blackwood had made a serious mistake in dismissing her unit so cavalierly. He had assumed that his position and authority would be enough to end the conversation, but he had severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. Sarah spent the rest of the evening reviewing her team's records and achievements. What she found reinforced her conviction that they deserved better treatment. Her unit had consistently outperformed larger, more prominent teams in every measurable category. Their mission success rate was nearly perfect, their marksmanship scores were off the charts, and their adaptability in challenging situations was unmatched. The next morning's team meeting was electric with tension and determination. When Sarah explained what had happened at Fort Braxton, the reaction from her soldiers was immediate and intense. These were professionals who took pride in their work and their capabilities, and they didn't appreciate being dismissed without consideration. So what's the plan, Captain? Asked Corporal Jennifer Walsh, one of the team's best long-range specialists. Are we going to let this slide? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her team members. These were some of the finest soldiers she had ever worked with, and they deserved better than Colonel Blackwood's casual dismissal. No, Corporal, we're not going to let this slide, but we're going to handle this the right way. We're going to prove our worth in a manner that leaves no room for doubt or interpretation. The plan Sarah outlined to her team was ambitious and risky, but it was also brilliant in its simplicity. If they couldn't get access to Fort Braxton's range through normal channels, they would create their own opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. And they would do it in a way that would force Colonel Blackwood to acknowledge their skills publicly. The key to the plan lay in an upcoming military competition that rotated between different bases each year. This year, it was scheduled to be held at Fort Braxton, and units from across the military would be competing in various categories, including marksmanship, tactical operations, and team coordination. Sarah had discovered that Fort Braxton was hosting the regional military skills competition in just 6 weeks. The event would bring together the best units from 15 different bases, competing in front of senior military leadership and media representatives. It was exactly the kind of high-profile event where exceptional performance would be noticed and remembered. The competition was open to any qualified unit, and Sarah's team more than met the entry requirements. What made it perfect for her purposes was that Colonel Blackwood would be serving as one of the primary hosts and judges for the event. He would have no choice but to witness firsthand the capabilities of a unit he had so readily dismissed. As Sarah explained the details of the competition to her team, she could see the excitement building in their eyes. This wasn't just about proving their worth anymore. It was about showing the entire military community what they were capable of achieving. The competition consists of 3 main events, Sarah continued: long-range precision shooting, tactical scenario simulation, and team coordination under stress. These are exactly the skills we would have been training for at Fort Braxton's range. Sergeant Chun raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's our timeline for preparation?" 6 weeks, Sarah replied. 6 weeks to prepare for the most important demonstration of our careers. We're going to train harder and more intensively than we ever have before. When we show up at Fort Braxton, we're going to be ready for anything they can throw at us. The room erupted in determined chatter as the team members began discussing training schedules and preparation strategies. Sarah felt a surge of pride as she watched her soldiers transform their initial anger and disappointment into focused determination. Over the following weeks, Sarah's unit embarked on the most intensive training regimen of their military careers. They practiced for hours every day, refining their techniques and developing new strategies for the upcoming competition. Word of their preparations began to spread throughout Fort Davidson, and other units started taking notice of the extraordinary commitment they were showing. Sarah also worked on the psychological aspect of the upcoming competition. She knew that performing under pressure in front of senior officers and media representatives would be different from their usual training exercises. She brought in specialists to help her team develop mental preparation techniques and stress management strategies. As the competition date approached, Sarah received confirmation that her team had been accepted as participants. She also learned some interesting information from her friend at the Pentagon about Fort Braxton's recent performance records. It turned out that despite all the colonels boasting about hosting elite units, the base's own teams have been performing poorly in recent competitions. This information gave Sarah additional confidence as she finalized her team's preparation. They weren't just going to compete, they were going to dominate. And Colonel Blackwood was going to have a front row seat to watch his assumptions about her little unit crumble before his eyes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either vindicate Sarah's team or end her military career. But as she looked at her soldiers during their final preparation session, Sarah felt no doubt about the outcome. They were ready to show the world what real military excellence looked like. The morning of the regional military skills competition dawned clear and crisp at Fort Braxton. Sarah Martinez and her team arrived at 0500 hours, 2 hours before the official check-in time. They wanted to familiarize themselves with the competition grounds and settle their nerves before the other teams arrived. As their transport vehicle passed through the main gate, Sarah noticed the significant changes that had been made to accommodate the competition. Large banners welcomed participants and spectators. Temporary bleachers had been erected around the various competition areas, and media trucks were already setting up equipment for coverage of the event. "Looks like they're taking this pretty seriously," observed Sergeant Chun as he unloaded their equipment bags. "Good," replied Sarah. "The bigger the audience, the better." Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing the competition rules and layout one final time. The event was structured as a 3-day tournament, with different challenges each day. The first day would focus on individual marksmanship skills, the second day would test tactical team operations, and the third day would combine all skills in a comprehensive scenario-based challenge. Points would be awarded based on accuracy, speed, and technique, with the overall winner determined by cumulative scores across all 3 days. What made this competition particularly significant was the caliber of teams participating. Units from Fort Benning, Fort Campbell, Fort Hood, and 12 other major installations had sent their best personnel. As Sarah's team began their equipment inspection and warm-up routine, other competing units started arriving. She recognized several teams by reputation, including the renowned Fort Campbell Rangers and a Marine Corps unit from Camp Pendleton that had won the previous year's competition. At 0800 hours, all participating teams were called to assemble in the main briefing hall for the opening ceremony. Colonel Blackwood stood at the podium, resplendent in his dress uniform with all his ribbons and medals gleaming under the bright lights. Behind him sat a panel of senior officers who would serve as judges, along with several military journalists and a television crew from the Armed Forces Network. "Welcome to the 2024 Regional Military Skills Competition," Colonel Blackwood announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. "Over the next 3 days, you will demonstrate the skills, discipline, and teamwork that make our military the finest fighting force in the world." Sarah noticed that the colonel's gaze swept over the assembled teams, pausing briefly when he spotted her unit. His expression flickered with what might have been recognition, but he quickly returned to his prepared remarks. "This competition is not just about winning," the colonel continued. "It's about pushing yourselves to achieve excellence, learning from other exceptional units, and representing your home bases with honor and distinction." The irony of hearing Colonel Blackwood talk about excellence and honor was not lost on Sarah. This was the same man who had dismissed her team without even reviewing their qualifications. She wondered if he had bothered to look up her unit's competition record since their meeting 6 weeks ago. After the opening ceremony, teams were given time to familiarize themselves with the competition areas before the first event began. Sarah led her team to the marksmanship range, the same facility she had requested access to months earlier. It was even more impressive than she had imagined, with state-of-the-art equipment and targets that could be adjusted for distance, lighting, and environmental conditions. "This is incredible," whispered Corporal Walsh, examining the precision rifle stations. "Look at these scopes and stabilization systems." "Don't get distracted by the equipment," Sarah reminded her team. "Remember, it's the shooter that matters, not the tools." As they completed their reconnaissance of the range, Sarah noticed Colonel Blackwood approaching with a small group of senior officers. He was clearly conducting a VIP tour, pointing out various features of the facility with obvious pride. "This is the most advanced military shooting range on the East Coast," she heard him telling his guests. "We've invested millions of dollars in equipment and technology to ensure our soldiers have every possible advantage." One of the visiting officers, a general Sarah didn't recognize, asked about the range's usage and training results. Colonel Blackwood launched into a lengthy explanation about the elite units that trained there and the exceptional results they achieved. "Of course," the colonel added with a slight smirk, "not every unit is qualified to use these facilities. We have to maintain strict standards to ensure the range is available for serious military training." Sarah felt her jaw clench as she remembered those same words from their meeting. The colonel was still as arrogant and dismissive as ever, apparently convinced that his facility was too good for certain types of soldiers. The first day's competition began at 1,000 hours with individual precision shooting. Each team member would fire from 3 different distances: 300 meters, 600 meters, and 1,000 meters. Targets were scored based on accuracy, with bonus points awarded for exceptional shot groups and speed of engagement. Sarah watched as teams took their turns on the range. The Fort Campbell Rangers performed well, as expected, achieving respectable scores at all distances. The Marine unit from Camp Pendleton struggled somewhat with the longer ranges, while a Navy SEAL team posted impressive numbers that had the judges taking notice. When it was her team's turn, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was what they had trained for, and this was what they excelled at. She had arranged for her team to shoot in a specific order, starting with their strongest performers to set the tone, and ending with their absolute best marksmen. Corporal Walsh stepped up to the 300-meter line first. She took her time adjusting her position, controlling her breathing, and finding her sight picture. When she fired, her first shot landed dead center in the target's bullseye. Her second shot hit less than an inch away, and her third shot was so close to the first that the judges had to use magnification to score it separately. The pattern continued as each member of Sarah's team took their turn. Consistent, precise shooting that demonstrated not just individual skill, but also the thorough training and preparation they had undergone. By the time Sergeant Chun stepped up for the 1,000-meter shots, a small crowd of spectators had gathered to watch. Shooting at 1,000 meters required exceptional skill and concentration. Environmental factors like wind, humidity, and even the Earth's rotation could affect bullet trajectory at that distance. Chen had always been the team's best long-range specialist, and he didn't disappoint. His 3 shots landed in a group so tight that the judges initially thought he had missed the target entirely until they realized all 3 bullets had passed through nearly the same hole. When the scores were announced at the end of the first day, Sarah's team had posted the highest individual marksmanship totals in the competition's history. They led the second-place team by a margin that had the judges double-checking their calculations. Colonel Blackwood was present for the score announcement, and Sarah watched his expression carefully as the results were read. His confident smile faltered when her team's name was announced as the Day 1 leader, and she could see him whispering urgently to one of his assistants. That evening, Sarah overheard some interesting conversations in the dining facility where all the competing teams were eating dinner. Word had spread quickly about the outstanding performance of the unknown team from Fort Davidson, and other competitors were asking questions about their background and training methods. "I've never seen shooting like that," one Marine was telling his teammates. 3 shots at 1,000 meters in a group you could cover with a quarter. That's not just skill, that's artistry. A Navy SEAL at another table was more analytical. Their technique is flawless. You can tell they've had exceptional training and probably thousands of hours of practice. They're not just good shooters, they're professionals. Sarah felt a surge of pride listening to these comments from some of the military's most elite personnel. These were exactly the kind of soldiers that Colonel Blackwood claimed deserved priority access to his range, and they were openly acknowledging her team's superior abilities. The second day of competition focused on tactical team operations. Teams would navigate through a series of scenarios designed to test their communication, coordination, and decision-making under pressure. The challenges included urban warfare simulations, hostage rescue scenarios, and precision engagement of multiple targets while protecting civilians. Sarah knew this was where her team's true strength would shine. They had worked together for years, developing an almost telepathic understanding of each other's capabilities and tendencies. Their communication was efficient and precise, their movements were coordinated and purposeful, and their decision-making was swift and accurate. The first tactical scenario placed teams in a mock urban environment with buildings, vehicles, and civilian mannequins scattered throughout. The objective was to eliminate a specific set of targets while avoiding civilian casualties and reaching a designated extraction point within a time limit. Sarah watched as the Marine unit tackled the course first. They moved aggressively and efficiently, but their approach was somewhat mechanical and predictable. The Navy SEALs were more creative in their tactics, but they made several communication errors that cost them valuable time. When her team entered the scenario, Sarah saw immediately how their preparation would pay off. They moved through the course like a single organism, each member knowing instinctively where the others would be and what they would do. Their target engagement was swift and precise, and they completed the course in record time without a single civilian casualty. The second scenario was even more challenging, requiring teams to assault a building and rescue hostages while engaging multiple hostile targets. The scenario was designed to test both shooting accuracy and tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. Sarah's team approached this challenge with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. They conducted a thorough reconnaissance, developed a coordinated assault plan, and executed it flawlessly. Their target engagement was so precise that they were able to eliminate threats that were positioned dangerously close to hostages without any risk to the civilian mannequins. By the end of the second day, Sarah's team had not only maintained their lead, but had actually increased their margin over the second-place team. Their tactical performance had been so dominant that other competing units were openly speculating about their background and training methods. Colonel Blackwood was becoming increasingly agitated as the competition progressed. Sarah noticed him having heated conversations with his staff and spending considerable time reviewing the scoring procedures with the judges. It was clear that the outstanding performance of the team he had dismissed was causing him significant embarrassment. On the evening of the second day, Sarah was approached by the general she had seen during the colonel's VIP tour. General Patricia Sullivan was the commanding officer for the military district that included Fort Braxton, and she was clearly interested in learning more about Sarah's unit. "Captain Martinez," the general said, "I've been watching your team's performance with great interest. Their skills are truly exceptional. Can you tell me about their training background?" Sarah saw this as an opportunity to subtly address the treatment they had received from Colonel Blackwood. "Thank you, ma'am. My team consists of highly experienced specialists who have served in multiple combat deployments. We've been seeking opportunities for advanced training to prepare for our upcoming assignment, but access to suitable facilities has been challenging." General Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Challenging how?" "Well, ma'am, we had hoped to train at Fort Braxton's excellent range facility, but we were told that our unit didn't meet the criteria for access." The general looked puzzled. "That's surprising, given what I've seen over the past 2 days. Who made that determination?" Before Sarah could answer, Colonel Blackwood appeared at her shoulder. He had obviously overheard at least part of the conversation and looked distinctly uncomfortable. "General Sullivan," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I wasn't aware you were speaking with Captain Martinez. I was just learning about her team's background and training," the general replied. "It's quite impressive. I understand they requested access to your range facility, but were turned down." Colonel Blackwood's face flushed slightly. "Yes, ma'am. We have very limited capacity and have to prioritize based on operational requirements." General Sullivan looked from the colonel to Sarah and back again. "I see. Well, based on what I've observed here, it seems like that might have been a missed opportunity." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement calling all team leaders to a briefing for the final day's competition. As they walked toward the briefing room, Sarah could feel the tension radiating from Colonel Blackwood. She sensed that the final day would bring everything to a head. The third day's challenge was the most comprehensive and demanding of the entire competition. Teams would face a complex scenario that combined all the skills tested in the previous days while adding additional elements of strategy, leadership, and adaptability. The scenario was designed to simulate a real-world mission where teams would need to gather intelligence, engage multiple targets at various distances, rescue personnel under fire, and extract safely while being pursued by opposing forces. It was exactly the type of challenge that would reveal which teams were truly exceptional and which were merely competent. Sarah spent the evening before the final competition reviewing the scenario details with her team and fine-tuning their approach. She knew that this would be their last chance to make a definitive statement about their capabilities, and she wanted to ensure they were completely prepared. As her team discussed strategy and contingencies, Sarah felt a sense of confidence that went beyond mere hope or optimism. They had proven themselves capable of exceptional performance under pressure, and they had done it while representing a unit that had been dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Tomorrow would bring the final test, and Sarah was determined to ensure that Colonel Blackwood's smugness would not survive the day intact. Her team had worked too hard and performed too well to let this opportunity pass without making the most powerful statement possible about their true capabilities. The final day of competition dawned with an atmosphere of electric anticipation at Fort Braxton. Word about the exceptional performance of Sarah's team had spread throughout the base and beyond, attracting additional spectators, including media representatives and senior military officials who had not originally planned to attend. Sarah woke at 0430 hours, 2 hours before her usual competition routine, but found herself unable to return to sleep. The weight of the day ahead pressed on her mind, not with anxiety, but with a crystal-clear focus that she had learned to recognize as her peak performance state. Today would determine not just who won the competition, but whether her team's reputation would be established on a foundation of undeniable excellence. As she conducted her morning inspection of equipment and reviewed the final scenario details, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating meeting in Colonel Blackwood's office. What had begun as a simple request for training access had evolved into something much more significant, a public demonstration of military competence that would be witnessed by some of the most influential people in the armed forces. The final scenario was called Operation Crosswind, and it was designed to test every aspect of military teamwork and individual skill under extreme pressure. Teams would begin at separate starting points around a complex training area that included buildings, vehicles, natural terrain features, and multiple elevation changes. The mission briefing revealed a challenging multi-part objective. Teams had to infiltrate a compound, gather intelligence from 3 separate locations, eliminate specific high-value targets while protecting civilians, rescue a downed pilot under enemy fire, and extract to a designated pickup zone while being pursued by opposing forces simulated by ranged safety officers with paint marking systems. What made the scenario particularly demanding was that teams would be operating with limited communication, restricted ammunition, and strict time constraints. They would need to demonstrate not only technical proficiency, but also tactical creativity, adaptability when plans went wrong, and the kind of seamless coordination that only came from exceptional training and mutual trust. Sarah gathered her team for their final preparation session at 0600 hours. The 11 other soldiers who comprised her unit sat in a circle around a detailed map of the training area, their faces reflecting the same focused intensity she felt. "Today we show them who we really are," Sarah began, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel determination. "Everything we've worked for, every hour of training, every challenge we've overcome together has led to this moment." Sergeant Chun spread out aerial photographs of the training area alongside detailed building layouts and elevation maps. "The approach routes are going to be critical. We'll be operating in full view of the judges and spectators, so every movement needs to be deliberate and professional." Corporal Walsh pointed to several locations on the map. "These sniping positions will give us overwatch for the civilian protection areas, but the angles are tricky. We'll need to coordinate our movements carefully to maintain coverage without crossing fields of fire." As the team discussed strategy and contingencies, Sarah felt the familiar sense of confidence that came from working with soldiers who understood their jobs perfectly and trusted each other completely. These were professionals who had earned their expertise through years of dedication and sacrifice, and they deserved the recognition that had been denied to them by Colonel Blackwood's prejudiced assumptions. At 0800 hours, all competing teams assembled for the final briefing. Colonel Blackwood stood before them, but his usual confident demeanor seemed somewhat strained. Sarah noticed that he avoided making eye contact with her team, and that his prepared remarks lacked the enthusiasm he had shown during the opening ceremony. "Today's scenario will test everything you've learned and demonstrated over the past 2 days," the colonel announced. "The complexity and difficulty of this challenge reflects the kind of real-world missions our military personnel face in combat situations around the globe." He outlined the specific rules of engagement, scoring criteria, and safety procedures that would govern the final competition. Teams would be judged on mission completion time, accuracy of target engagement, protection of civilian assets, tactical creativity, and overall professionalism under pressure. "Remember," Colonel Blackwood concluded, "you are being evaluated not just on your individual skills, but on your ability to function as a cohesive military unit. The winning team will be the one that best exemplifies the values and capabilities we expect from our finest soldiers." Sarah almost smiled at the irony of hearing Colonel Blackwood talk about finest soldiers while standing in front of the team he had refused to acknowledge just weeks earlier. She wondered if he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error in judgment. The competition schedule had been arranged so that teams would rotate through the scenario in reverse order of their current standings. This meant that Sarah's team, as the current leader, would perform last, with all spectators and judges present to witness their attempt. As the morning progressed, Sarah watched the other teams tackle the challenging scenario. The Navy SEAL unit performed competently, completing all objectives with efficiency and professionalism. The Marine Corps team showed impressive tactical creativity, but struggled with the precision shooting requirements. The Fort Campbell Rangers demonstrated excellent teamwork, but made several timing errors that cost them valuable points. Each team's performance was broadcast on large screens visible to all spectators, with expert commentary from senior military officers explaining the technical aspects of various tactics and techniques. Sarah used this opportunity to refine her team's approach based on what they observed, identifying potential problems and optimal solutions for each phase of the mission. By early afternoon, 10 teams had completed the scenario, and the scoring was remarkably close among the top competitors. The margin of victory would likely be determined by small differences in execution rather than major successes or failures. When Sarah's team was finally called to the starting position, the atmosphere around the training area was charged with anticipation. Word had spread about their dominant performance over the first 2 days, and spectators were eager to see whether they could maintain their excellence under the pressure of the final challenge. General Sullivan had positioned herself with the primary judging panel, and Sarah noticed several other senior officers who had arrived specifically to observe the final team's performance. Colonel Blackwood stood with the judges, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language betraying obvious tension. Team Alpha 7, you are cleared to begin Operation Crosswind, came the announcement over the loudspeaker system. Sarah led her team into the training area with a controlled urgency that had become their signature approach. Their first objective was an intelligence gathering point located in a 3-story building that required careful navigation and precise timing to avoid simulated security systems. Moving with practiced efficiency, the team split into predetermined elements. Sarah led the primary assault group through the building's main entrance while Sergeant Chun took a smaller element to secure the rear approach. Corporal Walsh and 2 other specialists moved to elevated positions that provided overwatch for both entry teams. The intelligence gathering went flawlessly, with team members locating and photographing the required documents while maintaining security and communication protocols. Their movements through the building were smooth and professional, demonstrating the kind of coordination that came from extensive training and mutual trust. The second phase of the mission required the team to eliminate 3 high-value targets positioned among civilian mannequins in a complex outdoor environment. This was perhaps the most technically demanding portion of the scenario, requiring precision shooting at various distances while ensuring no civilian casualties. Sarah's marksmen moved into position with the fluid grace of dancers performing a rehearsed routine. Each shooter had studied the target locations and developed specific plans for engagement angles and timing. When they opened fire, the results were devastating in their precision. All 3 high-value targets were eliminated with single shots, and not one civilian mannequin was touched. The third phase involved rescuing a downed pilot located in a defended position while under simulated enemy fire. This required tactical movement under pressure, coordinated suppressive fire, and medical evacuation procedures all executed simultaneously. Sarah's team approached this challenge with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. They established covering positions, coordinated their advance through carefully planned movement phases, and reached the downed pilot position in record time. The pilot extraction was executed flawlessly, with proper medical protocols and tactical security maintained throughout. The final phase of the mission was perhaps the most challenging: extraction to a designated pickup zone while being pursued by opposing forces equipped with paint marking systems that would indicate casualties if team members were successfully engaged. This phase tested not only tactical movement and evasion techniques, but also the team's ability to maintain mission effectiveness while under direct pressure. Sarah's team moved through the extraction route like ghosts, using terrain features and tactical timing to avoid detection while maintaining the pace necessary to reach the pickup zone within the required time limit. When they reached the extraction point, every team member was present and accounted for. All mission objectives had been completed, and they had sustained 0 simulated casualties during the pursuit phase. Their total time for the entire scenario was the fastest recorded in the competition's history. The reaction for spectators was immediate and enthusiastic. Applause erupted from the viewing areas as the final scores were calculated and verified. Sarah could see senior officers engaged in animated discussions about what they had just witnessed, and several media representatives were conducting hurried interviews with military experts. When the final results were announced, Sarah's team had not only won the competition, but had set new records in multiple categories. Their margin of victory was the largest in the event's history, and their overall performance had been so dominant that second-place finishers were congratulating them with genuine admiration rather than disappointment. Colonel Blackwood stood at the podium to announce the results, but his usual confident bearing had been replaced by something that looked distinctly like embarrassment. As he read the scores and achievements of Sarah's team, his voice lacked the enthusiasm he had shown when discussing his base's capabilities just 3 days earlier. The 2024 Regional Military Skills Competition winner, with record-setting performances in all categories, is a specialized marksmanship unit from Fort Davidson, led by Captain Sarah Martinez, Colonel Blackwood announced, the words seeming to stick in his throat. The cheers from the spectators were thunderous, but Sarah was watching the colonel's face as he spoke. She could see the moment when the full implications of the situation became clear to him. This was the same unit he had dismissed as unworthy of training access. The same soldiers he had suggested should focus on activities more appropriate to their capabilities. As Sarah led her team to the podium to accept their awards, she caught Colonel Blackwood's eye for the first time since their original meeting. The smug confidence that had characterized his earlier dismissal of her unit was completely gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like panic as he realized the magnitude of his professional misjudgment. General Sullivan stepped forward to present the awards, her expression reflecting both admiration for the winning team and something else that suggested the colonel's problems were just beginning. "Captain Martinez," the general said as she presented the competition trophy, "your team's performance has been absolutely exceptional. Their skills and professionalism represent the very best of our military capabilities." She paused, looking directly at Colonel Blackwood before continuing. "I understand this unit requested training access to Fort Braxton's facilities, but was denied. Given what we've witnessed here, I think we need to have a serious discussion about how such decisions are made." The color drained from Colonel Blackwood's face as the implications of the general's words became clear. His dismissal of Sarah's team was no longer a private personnel decision, but a public embarrassment that had been witnessed by senior military leadership and media representatives. Sarah accepted the trophy and awards on behalf of her team, but she could feel the dramatic shift in atmosphere around them. What had begun as a simple training request had become a powerful demonstration of military excellence that would have consequences extending far beyond the competition itself. As the ceremony concluded and spectators began to disperse, Sarah noticed Colonel Blackwood standing alone near the podium, looking like a man who had just realized that his professional reputation had been severely damaged by his own arrogance and poor judgment. The reckoning that Sarah had hoped for was beginning, but she suspected it was only the start of the consequences that would flow from this very public demonstration of the capabilities he had so dismissively rejected. The aftermath of the competition created ripples that spread far beyond Fort Braxton's training grounds. Within hours of the final ceremony, news of the record-breaking performance by the previously unknown unit from Fort Davidson was circulating through military networks across the country. Social media posts, news articles, and official military communications all highlighted the exceptional achievements of Captain Martinez's team. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. Military journalists wanted interviews about their training methods, senior officers sought details about their background and capabilities, and other military units were requesting information about their techniques and preparation strategies. But the most significant attention came from General Patricia Sullivan, who had requested a private meeting with Sarah immediately following the award ceremony. They met in a conference room adjacent to Colonel Blackwood's office, a location that Sarah suspected was deliberately chosen. "Captain Martinez," General Sullivan began, "I need to understand exactly what happened with your unit's request for training access. The performance I witnessed today suggests we may have a serious problem with how training resources are allocated." Sarah had anticipated this conversation and had prepared her response carefully. She wanted to present the facts objectively while allowing the general to draw her own conclusions about Colonel Blackwood's decision-making process. "Ma'am, 6 weeks ago, I requested access to Fort Braxton's shooting range for my specialized unit. I provided detailed documentation of our qualifications, mission requirements, and proposed training schedule. Colonel Blackwood denied the request without reviewing our materials, stating that our unit didn't meet the criteria for advanced training access." General Sullivan frowned. "What criteria was he referring to?" "He didn't specify, ma'am." He indicated that the range was reserved for elite units and suggested that we should focus on activities more appropriate to our capabilities. The general's expression grew increasingly serious as Sarah recounted the details of their meeting. When Sarah mentioned the colonel's dismissive comments about her little unit and his implications about their lack of qualifications, General Sullivan's jaw visibly tightened. "Did you provide any documentation of your team's performance history or qualifications?" the general asked. "I attempted to, ma'am, but Colonel Blackwood declined to review it. He stated that his decision was final and that some units were better suited for different types of training." General Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what she was hearing. Finally, she looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed concern with determination. "Captain, I want you to know that the performance your team demonstrated today represents exactly the kind of military excellence we strive for across all our installations. The fact that access to advanced training was denied to soldiers of this caliber represents a serious failure in judgment." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. Colonel Blackwood entered, looking decidedly uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with both women. "General Sullivan," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I wanted to congratulate Captain Martinez on her team's outstanding performance today." The general's response was immediate and direct. "Colonel Blackwood, I'm glad you're here. I've been discussing Captain Martinez's previous request for training access. Can you explain to me why a unit of this obvious caliber was denied the opportunity to train at your facility?" Colonel Blackwood's face flushed as he realized the conversation he had walked into. "Ma'am, I received numerous training requests, and I have to prioritize based on available resources and operational requirements. What specific operational requirements led you to conclude that this unit didn't warrant training access?" General Sullivan's tone was sharp and professional, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice. The colonel shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find a response that would justify his decision. "Well, ma'am, we have limited capacity and have to focus on units with the highest priority missions." "And how did you determine that Captain Martinez's unit didn't have high-priority missions?" the general pressed. Sarah watched as Colonel Blackwood realized he was trapped by his own poor judgment. Any answer he gave would either admit that he hadn't properly evaluated her unit's requirements or would force him to criticize the mission priorities established by higher command. "I base my assessment on the information available at the time," he said finally, his voice lacking conviction. General Sullivan leaned forward. "Colonel, according to Captain Martinez, you declined to review the documentation she provided about her unit's qualifications and mission requirements. Is that accurate?" The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds as Colonel Blackwood struggled to formulate a response. Finally, he admitted, "I may not have had time to review all the materials in detail during that particular meeting." "I see," General Sullivan replied, her tone indicating that she saw quite clearly indeed. "So you denied training access to what we now know is an exceptionally capable unit without bothering to properly evaluate their request." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and professional satisfaction as she watched Colonel Blackwood's arrogance finally catch up with him. This was the reckoning she had hoped for, but seeing it unfold was more gratifying than she had anticipated. "Ma'am," the colonel said, attempting to recover some composure, "I made what I believed was the best decision for the base, given the circumstances and competing demands for the facility." General Sullivan's response was swift and decisive. "Colonel, the circumstances and competing demands you're referring to apparently included denying access to one of the most skilled military units I've ever observed. That suggests to me that your decision-making process needs a serious examination." She turned to Sarah. "Captain Martinez, I want you to know that your unit will have priority access to any training facility in this region. Additionally, I'm initiating a comprehensive review of training resource allocation procedures to ensure this type of situation doesn't happen again." The general then addressed Colonel Blackwood directly. "Colonel, I want a detailed report on my desk within 48 hours explaining your training access policies and procedures. I also want to see all requests that have been denied over the past 6 months, along with your justification for those decisions. Colonel Blackwood's face had gone pale as the implications of the general's words became clear. This was no longer just about one denied training request. It had become a formal investigation into his command decisions and leadership judgment. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure. Her team had not only vindicated themselves through exceptional performance, but had also exposed the flawed decision-making that had led to their initial rejection. The Colonel's Smugness had indeed not survived the day. Over the following weeks, the consequences of the competition continued to unfold. The military media coverage of Sarah's team's record-breaking performance brought national attention to their achievements. They received commendations from senior military leadership, invitations to participate in advanced training programs, and requests from other units seeking to learn from their methods. More significantly, General Sullivan's investigation into Fort Braxton's training allocation procedures revealed a pattern of poor decision-making that extended well beyond Sarah's case. Several other highly qualified units had been denied access based on superficial assessments rather than thorough evaluations of their capabilities and requirements. Within 2 months, Colonel Blackwood was quietly transferred to an administrative position at a desk job in the Pentagon, effectively ending his command career. The official explanation cited the need for his expertise in training coordination, but everyone who knew the situation understood the real reason for his reassignment. Sarah received a call from her new commanding officer at Fort Davidson informing her that her unit had been selected for a high-profile deployment that would utilize their specialized skills in a critical mission. The recognition they had gained from the competition had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed for years. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Sarah received a formal letter from the commanding officer of Fort Braxton's new training facility requesting her unit's assistance in developing advanced marksmanship curriculum for other military units. The same range facility that Colonel Blackwood had declared off-limits was now seeking their expertise to improve its programs. The letter was signed by Colonel Blackwood's replacement, who had reviewed their competition performance and recognized the value of their experience and methods. It was a complete reversal of the previous administration's attitude and a validation of everything Sarah's team had worked to achieve. When Sarah shared the news with her team, the reaction was a mixture of professional pride and personal satisfaction. They had proven that excellence speaks for itself, regardless of the initial skepticism or prejudice they might encounter. Sergeant Shin summed up the team's feelings during their next training session. "Ma'am, it's amazing how much people's opinions can change when they actually see what you're capable of instead of making assumptions." Corporal Walsh added, "I guess some people need to see the results before they believe in the capability." Sarah nodded, but she also recognized the broader lesson from their experience. The important thing to remember is that we didn't do this for recognition or to prove anyone wrong. We did it because we're professionals who take pride in our work. The recognition just happened to follow. As her unit prepared for their upcoming deployment, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that frustrating meeting in Colonel Blackwood's office. What had begun as a simple request for training access had evolved into a career-defining demonstration of military excellence that would influence their opportunities for years to come. The Colonel's Smugness had indeed not survived their encounter, but more importantly, Sarah's team had established themselves as a model of professional competence that would serve as an inspiration for other military units facing similar challenges. 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a military leadership conference about the importance of objective evaluation in training resource allocation. The organizers specifically cited her team's competition performance as an example of what could be achieved when soldiers were given appropriate opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. As she prepared her remarks for the conference, Sarah thought about Colonel Blackwood and wondered if he had learned anything from their encounter. She hoped he had, because the military was too important an institution to be diminished by the kind of prejudiced decision-making he had demonstrated. But regardless of what lessons the colonel might have learned, Sarah was confident that her team's example would continue to inspire other soldiers who faced skepticism about their capabilities. They had proven that excellence could overcome prejudice, that professional competence could triumph over arrogant assumptions, and that sometimes the best response to dismissive treatment was simply to demonstrate superior performance. The story of their competition victory and its aftermath became something of a legend within military circles, told and retold as an example of how skilled soldiers could overcome institutional bias through exceptional achievement. It served as a reminder that in the military, as in any profession, results ultimately matter more than initial impressions or superficial judgments. Sarah's team continued to excel in their subsequent assignments, building on the foundation of recognition they had established through their competition performance. They became known throughout the military as a unit that could be counted on to deliver exceptional results regardless of the challenges they faced. And Colonel Blackwood's former Smugness became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making important decisions based on prejudice rather than professional evaluation. It was a lesson that resonated with military leaders at all levels and contributed to improvements in how training resources were allocated across the entire command structure. The encounter that had begun with such professional frustration had ultimately resulted in positive changes that benefited not just Sarah's unit, but the entire military training system. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the best way to address unfair treatment is simply to perform so exceptionally that the unfairness becomes impossible to ignore or defend. Her team had done exactly that, and in the process, they had proven that true military excellence will always find a way to shine through, regardless of the obstacles placed in its path.